Is this the end for Airbnb in Canada? BC essentially banning Airbnb. We're going to get into what's going on in BC, what's going on in other places, and how this is going to affect Airbnb and the housing market and the rental market. So let's get right into it and see what's going on. So BC increases violation fines, will require data sharing for more short-term rentals. New rules come as municipalities struggle to regulate rentals on sites like Airbnb. So it's really interesting what's going on. And you just have to think of it. Airbnb has been scrutinized by so many different people, including myself. And the thing is, it has been allowed to kind of skirt all the regulations that hotels have to deal with every single day. And all at a time when the hotel industry has been suffering massively from the pandemic. So, it's really crazy when you think about it. I mean, I spoke to a hotel owner here in Calgary. He owns 2 hotels and they have over $10 million of debt still. And that's even with the massive uptake in travel that they've seen over this year and last year. So it's interesting, but let's continue to see what they say here. BC has put in place new legislation to help municipalities regulate short-term rentals on sites like Airbnb, which provincial and municipal leaders say is affecting the availability and price of long-term housing. The new rules passed first reading in the BC legislature Monday and include increasing fines for hosts breaking local municipal bylaw rules to $3,000 per infraction per day from $1,000. All short-term rental platforms will also be required to share data with municipalities to improve local enforcement, although no private information about hosts will be released publicly. So that is very interesting because that could really improve enforcement if you think about it. If they're sharing the data of hosts that are essentially in breach of the rules, then they can go straight there and just fine them. So, that improves it massively because that has been one of the hurdles for different places that have been trying to regulate Airbnb is actually the data sharing aspect. But also that is potentially bad because you're just increasing data sharing among the government. And, you can't have it both ways. If you want data sharing when it comes to things like Airbnb, but then you don't want in terms of data sharing for things like a central bank digital currency where all your purchases can be seen by the government. But obviously this is a slightly different scenario because Airbnb has had massive impacts on the housing market. It's had massive impacts on the rental market, especially over the past couple of years. And the growth of Airbnb has been quite frankly insane. So I want to show you a couple of charts here. So this is a really interesting one and it comes from AirDNA. 54% of Airbnb listings have been added since 2020. Just think about this. So basically each color has a corresponding year with it up there that you can see. And basically you can see that since 2020, so much of the total amount of inventory has been added since then. So you've got 2020, 2021, 2022, which is now more than 54% of total Airbnb inventory. So think about that. Most of the Airbnb hosts have bought at the peak of the bubble, essentially. So what kind of position does that put them in with these new type of regulations that are coming forward? And even in places that aren't regulated, I think it's just stupid to be buying an Airbnb and not expecting this to happen. I mean, this is going to come no matter where you are, which province you're in. You're not going to be able to avoid this, unfortunately. I believe the regulation of Airbnb is just going to increase and increase and increase over time, and it's just going to gain more scrutiny. And Airbnb could quite frankly go bust anyway from all this because it's not just Canada, which is a relatively small market for Airbnb. You've got the United States, major markets like New York essentially banning Airbnb. That has big impacts for Airbnb's revenue, obviously. Unless Airbnb is somehow managing to adjust its business model, there's really not much of a business model there because they're essentially losing money right now anyway. They're not making a great deal of money. Their margins are razor thin and their costs and expenses are insanely high. So it's going to be very interesting to see how Airbnb does actually moving into the future. And this shows you what basically happened. 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, there was very little growth, even though it was doubling. But look what happened around 2015, 2016. You just saw from 2014 to 2016, the listings globally went from 550,000 to 2.3 million listings. So obviously that is a massive increase, and nobody can deny that that is going to have some part of an impact on the housing markets wherever you are if you're seeing these massive increases in Airbnb listings. And no other place has been exempt from this, really. I mean, you've seen Canada, the United States, Mexico, smaller housing markets as well have been equally impacted by people wanting to do Airbnb. And to be honest, my research into Airbnb has been extensive because I've been thinking maybe it's a potential opportunity in the future when this bubble bursts, and we'll continue to see how that materializes. But generally, what I found when it comes to Airbnb, the type of people who are hosts for these Airbnbs are generally less sophisticated. They're not running them like a business. They don't really take them seriously, and it's just seen as like a side hustle or a money maker for them. It's not seen as a business. So you've got real amateurs that are involved in this Airbnb game. And I think that's worth noting, because obviously when you've got dumb money, when you've got real amateurs in there, that can cause massive bubbles and it can cause massive collapses at the same time as well, because these people, a lot of people bought them on margin. Even in places like Mexico, people took out from their home equity thinking their house price is going to go up indefinitely. Interest rates were at historic lows then, and essentially they took that money and they went and bought a Airbnb cash in Mexico. Now, this is something that the Mexican real estate people, they don't understand and they can't see. So it's really interesting. This Airbnb thing is going to be interesting. I want to show you this because this is particularly interesting. Better Dwelling put out this last year. Airbnb boost to Canadian real estate inventory. The potential increase in real estate listings if 25% of Airbnb properties were listed for sale. Now, just remember, guys, they are talking about 25% of Airbnb properties going for sale. And you can see that Toronto, it would be more than 30%. You would see a more than 30% growth in real estate inventory. Montreal, over 25%. Vancouver, slightly less. And when you actually look at a lot of the BC markets, it's mainly the smaller markets that will be affected by this. But then obviously there is actually a cap, and we'll get into that now as we go through the nitty-gritty of what this regulation essentially is. All short-term rental platforms will have to include the business license and registration numbers of listings where they are required by local government, and must remove listings without those requirements quickly. The province says the new rules, which come into effect in stages from now through late 2024, are meant to create minimum regulatory standard for housing available for rent fewer than 90 days. The province said there are around 28,000 daily active short-term rental listings in BC, which is an increase of 20% from a year ago. So again, just think about the increase there and think about how that is increasing with the backdrop of really high interest rates right now. So obviously it's not the sophisticated investors that are diving into Airbnb right now. It is your mostly unsophisticated investor. It's your retail investor. It's your emotional investor. It's your dumb money that is going into Airbnb, interestingly enough. So data indicates that more than 16,000 entire homes are being listed as short-term rentals for the majority of the calendar year, according to provincial officials. The legislation limits short-term rentals to within a host's home or a basement suite or a laneway home on the property where they reside. So obviously that is going to take out the majority of Airbnb listings just with that part of the regulation in itself. And then it goes on further to say more than a dozen resort municipalities, mountain resort areas, electoral areas, including the Gulf Islands, and most municipalities with a population under 10,000 people will initially be exempt from the principal residence requirement, but can opt in if the local government decides to. So that's interesting, and we'll have to see what happens there. But obviously there are a lot of small markets in BC because a lot of people go on vacation there, and they have boomed because a lot of people haven't been going abroad. They've been staying here in Canada because of the pandemic, maybe because of cost, because it's cheaper, even though I don't find it is cheaper to stay here because the cost of living is so insane. These Airbnbs, some of them in places like the Okanagan, at the peak, were going for around $6,000 a week just for a standard 3-bedroom place. So it's kind of crazy, the numbers that we saw. They've declined a lot since then, and obviously the expenses for the homeowners have gone up massively, especially if they bought that with variable rate debt, which a lot of people did. They bought it with variable rate debt. And even if they initially bought with home equity lines of credit and then took out a mortgage, it doesn't matter because essentially they're taking out that mortgage at high interest rates. They're being impacted anyway, even though they're getting a lower rate than their their home equity lines of credit. So it's interesting what's happening in BC, and that 10,000 and the population of 10,000 exemption requirement is an interesting one that will affect a few places, but it will be interesting to see, do the local municipalities opt in or not? So Airbnb says its platform allows residents in cities with expensive real estate to help pay for their mortgages. It does not agree with studies that show short-term rentals contribute to overall rent increases. I mean, this is exactly what you would expect Airbnb to say, right? I mean, their platform really initially was like, if you have a spare room in your house, you rent it out on a platform like Airbnb. It wasn't that people buy entire houses and then rent it out on the platform, but that's essentially what it turned into. So basically, Airbnb's business model has changed massively, and obviously they may not even be aware of the impacts, but there have been so many studies. You don't even have to look at the studies. You just have to look at those charts, which I showed you, to realize that obviously this has a huge impact. And obviously when interest rates go down, that has a huge impact as well. You saw in 2020, because interest rates were low, just so many people got in 2020, 2021, 2022, and they bought these Airbnbs. It really started to rip after 2014. That's when you saw this just exponential growth in Airbnb listings. The impact is obvious, especially when you break it down like Better Dwelling did here, and you show it as a percentage of the total housing inventory, essentially. So a lot of this, it's going to be heading onto the rental market. It's going to be heading onto the housing market. It's going to be incredibly interesting to see what happens. And obviously you've got Calgary, which is clamping down. You know, Calgary is a very woke, liberal city, even though it's in a conservative province. And they are coming out with more regulations for Airbnb, and I'm sure there will be more in the future too. The city of Calgary says it hopes to roll out new business licenses requirements for short-term rentals beginning next January after research into the market. The city's response comes after an October rent report suggests an average one-bedroom apartment in Calgary is now around $1,730 a month, a 13.2% year-over-year increase. The average two-bedroom apartment is $2,182 a month, a 13.6% year-over-year increase. So rents are just skyrocketing essentially in Calgary. Obviously, there's been a massive growth in short-term rentals as well. In fact, I'm going to pull that up, show you right now. So if you look at what's happened in Calgary, you know, this is the listing growth right here. So when you're talking short-term rentals, that market, that inventory is gone from the housing market, it's gone from the rental market. So, you know, when that happens, that's not a good thing, obviously, for those markets. These markets, Airbnb particularly, have kind of skirted around all the red tape that things like hotels have to deal with. I mean, if I want to open a hotel in my residential neighborhood, you know, I'm going to have to apply for all these permits, and people are going to have to essentially voice their opinion from the around me. But essentially what you've had happen with Airbnb, people can just put it on the site. It's good to go, essentially. You might have to get a business license. Essentially, you can just list your home, and then your neighbors just have to deal with the aftermath of all the people that come and stay at the Airbnb constantly in and out. They're obviously not going to respect the place, and they're not going to care so much about the neighbors that are living right next to you. And this is what has kind of burnt so many people and left a bad taste in their mouth for Airbnb. But then you have people on the other side who own Airbnb, which are facing, you know, massive amounts of losses essentially. So Airbnb operator says he's facing losses of hundreds of thousands of dollars because of BC's new short-term rental laws. Right, okay. But the thing is, shouldn't he really have thought about this? I mean, this has been obvious to me for years and years that there has been more of an opposing view against Airbnb. But people, again, when they want something emotionally, they just avoid all the negative aspects and gloss over them, essentially. You've seen that with the Bank of Canada. You know, everybody talks about how the Bank of Canada came out and they said interest rates are going to be low for a long time. Nobody talks about how the Bank of Canada came out in early 2021, warned of said interest rates might go up, but nobody listens to that. And it's the same sort of thing with this Airbnb. It's just essentially people refusing to acknowledge what is actually going on and treat it seriously like a business and adapt to that environment. You know, people don't want to sell. That's the problem. That's what it comes down to in most cases. It's not just homeowners. It's even people with these Airbnbs just have this emotional attachment. They thought it was going to be their get rich quick scheme, and it's just not materialized. And part of that has been, unfortunately, due to interest rates being so low, people just being pushed further and further out on the risk curve, as I've said many, many times. So it's not just this story, there's also this story that's going on as well. I just hope my investment doesn't come crashing down on me. BC Airbnb owner responds to proposed crackdown. It's not proposed anymore since this has come out. It's obviously been passed. So let's see what they're saying here. Many Airbnb operators and property managers say the BC NDP's government's proposed crackdown on short-term rentals will kill their business or wipe out their retirement investment. Again, you know, retirement investments into Airbnb, like this is what's happened. This is what low interest rates for over a decade has done to people. It has sent them into this psychotic mania, which has basically been the housing market in Canada. It's sent them into this mania just thinking, you know what, I just need to get that income growth, so I'm going to have to go and take more risk to go and get that income growth. And then essentially, because it's housing, it only goes up, especially in Canada, even though in the past that hasn't been the case. And that just leads to people taking more and more risk. You can't rely on these things for your sole retirement benefit. You just cannot. You have to have a diversified retirement income. You can't just rely on one thing. Yet that is what most people try and do with their retirement. They'll buy a rental property and the rent is their entire retirement essentially. And the home equity also in their principal residence, that's their entire retirement as well, which is just catastrophic when you think about it, because the renter stops paying. Now they're completely screwed. So, you know, you have to have diversification, especially right now. You know, there's no excuse because we're seeing rates where you can get 5-year, you can even get a 20-year treasury at over 5.2%, 20 years. And, you know, if they cut rates, then guess what? You can sell that thing. It's interesting because for retirement, those sort of investments, they haven't been around for a long, long time, but now they're here. Yet you still got people that cannot get out of the concept and mentality of this real estate mania that they're in. They cannot realize what has happened and that the ground has shifted beneath their feet. Things have changed that are going to take a long time to change back. But let's hear what this lady says here. I just hope my investment doesn't come crashing down on me, said Deborah Sheets, who operates an Airbnb in the Janion building, which overlooks Johnson Street Bridge in downtown Victoria. She was responding to the BC's NDP Short-Term Rental Accommodations Act introduced by Housing Minister Ravi Kahlon, which will ban most short-term rentals that aren't in the operator's principal residence, increase fines, and create new enforcement unit to crack down on rule breakers. So, you know what? I've been to Victoria and I've seen what's happened to that city, and that is a city dying. That is a city that's dead, in my opinion. Any of you that live in Victoria will know this. I mean, don't get me wrong, the climate there is lovely. Some of the most amazing nature that is unspoiled is in Vancouver Island. But Victoria, the city, has just been totally trashed. I talked to business owners there. I visited there every single year. And, you know, it's just got worse and worse, essentially. More businesses closing down. They can't find staff because nobody wants to live there because the housing prices are so high. This lady really doesn't understand what has happened because of the housing market. And Airbnb is obviously a contributing factor to that, but it's not the only factor to look at. You've also got the fact that interest rates have been held so low for so long has just allowed this rampant speculation to increase and continue for the past more than a decade. And that has contributed to it even more because people's incomes in the local area just have not grown. The Kelowna mayor came out and said that they think it's going to have an immediate impact on what happens in Kelowna. I don't really think so, because when you look at what happens in Kelowna, it is a very seasonal Airbnb market. In the winter, Airbnbs are took off, and in the summer, you can see that the Airbnbs skyrocket to new highs. You can see that it has gone up essentially, and you've just had growth. Each high has just got higher here, so there has been more, but it's only around 2.3 thousand listings. Having said that, you really have to compare that to the total amount of housing supply available in that area. So, you know, if Kelowna has 3,000 homes for sale right now, then yeah, that's a huge amount if you really think about it of that inventory. So this Airbnb situation, we'll continue to monitor it. If you've enjoyed this video, you might like this video here, you might like this playlist here. If you're looking for a VPN to get around Bill C11, then go to expressvpn.com/marketmania. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.